You keep noticing the same strange pattern. The moment you finally think something is about to open, the door does not just close, it closes quietly, almost politely, as if heaven itself refuses to let you step through it. The job that looked perfect goes silent after the interview. The person who spoke like they cared suddenly becomes vague. The plan you prayed over seems to lose strength right when you gather the courage to move. And you have been left staring at your own life, wondering why. The timing keeps slipping through your hands when you have not been careless, when you have not been lazy, when you have been trying to obey God with the little strength you still have. This is the part that has been heavy. You are not only tired of waiting, you are tired of having to explain why you are still waiting. People see the outside and assume nothing is happening, but they do not see the restraint it takes not to panic. They do not see you sitting on the edge of your bed, phone in hand, reading the same message twice, deciding not to respond from fear. They do not see the prayers you whispered with no dramatic feeling afterward, only a thin quietness that somehow kept you from falling apart. What you have called delay may not have been abandonment. It may have been the long, hidden work of God separating you from versions of provision you would have mistaken for blessing, while connecting you to something larger, cleaner, and less fragile. The billionaire's blessing over your life is not just about money multiplying in your hands. It is about a level of provision that does not require you to betray your peace to keep it. It is about clarity after years of mental fog, emotional stability after being pulled apart by people's opinions, and purpose that does not collapse every time someone withdraws approval. The reason you have not seen it fully is not because it was never there. It is because God has been building the kind of person who can receive overflow without turning it into an idol, a performance, or a prison. The false belief you may have carried is that a blessing must be visible to be real. You thought that if God had assigned something to you, everyone would eventually recognize it, the path would become obvious, the people around you would understand, and the evidence would be strong enough to silence your doubts. But God often begins with evidence so small that pride cannot use it. A calm decision where you used to spiral, a refusal to chase someone who keeps you confused, a bill paid through an unexpected route not enough to brag about but enough to remind you that you were not forgotten, a quiet opportunity mentioned in a conversation you almost cancelled, a peace that comes while nothing external has changed. These are not small things when they arrive after a season where your nervous system learned to expect disappointment. Heaven does not always announce provision with noise. Sometimes it proves provision by training you not to collapse when the answer takes longer than you wanted. That is why the blessing connected to your life has felt hidden. It has been forming in areas nobody applauds: how you speak when you're frustrated, how you handle being misunderstood, how you respond when someone else receives what you prayed for, how you manage the little you have without letting lack make you cruel. There is a kind of wealth that begins as discipline. There is a kind of promotion that starts with emotional honesty. There is a kind of overflow that first looks like God removing your appetite for chaos. You may have been asking for a larger life, and God began by making your inner world less breakable. That can feel slow because the work is not always measurable. You cannot post a screenshot of patience. You cannot easily explain the victory of not sending the desperate text, not forcing the conversation, not exaggerating your pain to get sympathy, not taking the shortcut that would have cost you your integrity. But those choices matter. They are not random acts of self-control. They are signs that something in you is being made capable of holding more than survival. The blessing is not waiting for you to become perfect. It is meeting you as you become honest enough to stop mishandling what God gives you. There was a season when you almost became someone you would not have recognized. Not in an obvious, dramatic way, but in the slow way disappointment changes a person's tone. You started checking your life against other people's timelines. You became sensitive to small remarks. You smiled at good news while feeling something sharp inside because you were happy for them, but also exhausted by your own unanswered prayers. Maybe you opened your banking app and stared at the numbers with that familiar pressure in your chest, then closed it quickly, as if not looking would make the fear less real. Maybe you drafted a message to someone who hurt you, deleted it, rewrote it, then sat in silence because the Holy Spirit would not let you use pain as a weapon. That is not weakness. That is warfare at the level most people never talk about, the battle between becoming bitter and becoming refined. The enemy does not always attack chosen people by destroying everything at once. Sometimes he tries to make them interpret God's silence as neglect. So they start grabbing for anything that feels like relief, a relationship that flatters the wound, a decision made from panic, a public image that hides private emptiness, an opportunity that looks wealthy but requires you to silence conviction. This is why your discernment had to grow before your circumstances expanded. If God had allowed certain doors to open when you were desperate for validation, you might have called bondage a blessing because it came dressed in success. So he slowed you down, not to humiliate you, but to let your motives come into the light. You learned which prayers were rooted in trust and which ones were secretly begging God to prove your worth to people who never had the authority to define it. That realization hurts, but it also frees you. If this has been painfully close to your own season, you can like the video as a quiet way of saying, I recognize what God has been doing in me, not for noise, not for performance, but because naming the truth can strengthen someone else who is watching in silence. The blessing already connected to you has been moving through redirection more than arrival. Think about the times you were angry that something did not work, only to later see the character of the people involved. The room you wanted access to was full of hidden pressure. The partnership looked promising, but every conversation made you feel smaller. The person you hoped would choose you could speak tenderness one day and confusion the next, and your soul kept losing peace trying to decode them. At first, you may have thought you were being denied, but later you realized you were being protected from attachments that would have drained the exact strength God was restoring. Divine protection does not always feel like comfort when it happens. Sometimes it feels like embarrassment. It feels like having to start over after telling people you were excited. It feels like deleting a dream from your plans without having language for what comes next. It feels like God asking you to walk away without giving you enough explanation to defend yourself. But protection is still protection, even when it damages your pride. The chosen life is not marked by getting everything you wanted at the time you wanted it. It is marked by learning to recognize God's mercy in the doors that refuse to open. Some of those doors were not evil. They were simply too small for what obedience would require of you. Some people were not demons. They were just not assigned to walk with you into the next level of responsibility. Some opportunities were not traps. They were tests of whether you could tell the difference between motion and alignment. And this is where spiritual maturity becomes practical. You stop calling every delay an attack, and you stop calling every shiny invitation a breakthrough. You begin to ask better questions. Does this pull me closer to God or make me perform for approval? Does this require secrecy that feels unclean? Does peace remain after the excitement fades? Are the people involved consistent in character or only impressive in language? The billionaire's blessing is too weighty to be carried by a confused heart. God is not only preparing things for you, he is teaching you to recognize what should not travel with you when those things arrive. There is a kind of provision that starts by making you less available to chaos. You may have noticed that recently certain conversations do not have the same power over you. Someone can be cold, and instead of spending 3 hours analyzing what changed, you feel the sting, take a breath, and return to what God told you to do. An old temptation can show up in a familiar form. And while part of you remembers the comfort it once gave, another part of you sees the cost immediately. That is not emotional numbness. That is healing with discernment. God has been making your peace less negotiable. This matters because overflow without peace becomes another form of pressure. Money without wisdom can expose wounds. Influence without humility can magnify insecurity. Love without discernment can become dependency. Open doors without obedience can scatter you in 10 directions while your soul grows empty. So God begins with the inner economy before the outer one. He teaches you how to steward attention, energy, words, and desire. He shows you where you keep spending yourself on people who only value access, not covenant. He confronts the part of you that confuses being needed with being loved. He lets you feel the exhaustion of proving yourself until you finally admit that proving is not the same as purpose. These lessons may not look like wealth, but they are the foundation of it in the kingdom sense. A person who can stay calm under pressure is carrying something valuable. A person who can tell the truth without cruelty is carrying something valuable. A person who can be generous without needing control is carrying something valuable. This is why the blessing feels like it has been forming behind curtains. You expected God to start with the visible harvest, but he started with the soil. You expected a new address, a new position, a new relationship, a new amount in the account. He started with your reactions, your boundaries, your appetite, your patience, your ability to hear no without losing yourself. Hidden preparation is not wasted time. It is the place where God removes the habits that would have made you mishandle the very provision you prayed for. A counterexample is necessary here, because not everything that looks large is from God, and not every intense feeling is confirmation. There are doors that open fast because they were never meant to be tested slowly. There are people who speak spiritual language but create emotional pressure, urgency, and confusion. There are offers that promise elevation while quietly demanding that you compromise your rest, your honesty, or your obedience. A person can say, "This is your moment," and still be using your hunger to control you. A connection can feel electric and still pull you away from prayer, wisdom, and peace. A financial chance can look like rescue and still be built on manipulation. This is why the blessing God gives does not need you to abandon discernment in order to receive it. God's guidance may stretch you, but it will not require you to become frantic. It may challenge your comfort, but it will not make fear your leader. It may ask for courage, but it will not force you into secrecy, obsession, or emotional slavery. You are allowed to test what comes to your life. You are allowed to slow down. You are allowed to ask God for wisdom without being accused of lacking faith. In fact, faith that refuses wisdom is often just anxiety wearing religious clothing. The chosen one does not prove they are chosen by chasing every sign. They prove maturity by surrendering the need to make signs happen. If someone is truly assigned to walk with you, consistency will reveal more than chemistry. If an opportunity is truly aligned, it will withstand prayer, counsel, and patient examination. If God is truly opening a door, you will not have to sin to keep it open. This is where many people miss the quiet blessing already theirs. They look for something dramatic while God is teaching them to value clean peace. They want a voice from heaven, but he is already speaking through the discomfort they feel when they are about to betray themselves. They want confirmation, but he is already confirming through the repeated pattern of what brings clarity and what brings confusion. The blessing is not fragile. You do not have to force it into existence. What God has connected to your obedience will not require you to become someone false in order to hold it. You may be in the part of the process where the first signs are beginning to appear, but they are easy to dismiss because they do not look big enough. You wake up one morning and the heaviness is still there, but it no longer owns the whole room. You pray, and instead of a dramatic answer, you sense one simple instruction: clean the space, answer the email, apologize without defending yourself, review the plan. Stop checking their page. Rest tonight. It seems too ordinary to be spiritual, yet obeying it changes the atmosphere. You notice that your mind is not racing the way it used to. You notice that an opportunity you are trying to force becomes less attractive, while a quieter path starts making more sense. You notice that the same person whose approval used to control your mood no longer has the same grip. Then, almost without announcement, life begins to move differently. Someone remembers your name. A conversation opens a door. A delayed response comes through. A skill you developed in private becomes useful in a way you did not expect. A small financial pressure lifts, not everything solved at once, but enough for you to breathe. These are not random crumbs. They are often the first visible edges of something that was being arranged while you thought nothing was happening. The hidden blessing is not always a sudden flood. Sometimes it is a sequence of mercies that teaches your heart how to trust again. God knows that if everything arrived at once, after a long season of pain, you might spend the first moments guarding it instead of receiving it. So he lets peace arrive before increase. He lets clarity arrive before access. He lets your identity settle before greater responsibility comes near. That order is mercy. You are not behind because your blessing begins with internal evidence. You are being taught to recognize God's hand before the crowd can clap for the result. And when provision grows, you will not shed to worship the provision because you will remember the nights when the only proof you had was the strength to take the next obedient step without applause. There is also a nuance that will keep your heart safe. Sometimes what you call the billionaire's blessing will not remove difficulty. It will change what difficulty can do to you. God may provide financially, but he may also teach you how to stop making fear your financial advisor. He may open relational doors, but he may also heal the part of you that used to confuse inconsistency with mystery. He may give you influence, but he may also hide you from attention until your character can survive being seen. This is not a message that says you will never struggle again. It is a message that says the struggle will not be allowed to waste what God has placed in you. There is a difference between being delayed and being developed. There is a difference between being hidden and being lost. There is a difference between surrender and passivity. Surrender still applies for the job, still learns the skill, still pays attention to patterns, still asks for counsel, still repents when needed, still rests when God says rest. Passivity waits for heaven to do what obedience was supposed to begin. The blessing already connected to you is not an excuse to avoid responsibility. It is a reason to become more faithful with today. Look at the fruit of this season, even if it came through pain. Are you more careful with your words? Are you less impressed by what lacks peace? Are you beginning to choose honesty over image? Are you able to pray for people without needing them to come back and validate you? Leave a comment answering this one question. What is one thing God asked you to release before he gave you more peace? Not everyone will understand that kind of answer, but someone else may read it and realize their own release was not a loss, but part of the preparation.